Angela Simpson tortured a disabled man for 3 days, driving nails into his head and pulling out his teeth before finally strangling him. When asked if she felt any remorse, her response left interviewers stunned.
So I took him to my house, walked him down the street. I don't know why the media acts like the couldn't walk. He walked very well. Walked him upstairs, kicked his him.
Today we have famous serial killers flipping out in their interviews. January 1992, Volusia County Courthouse, Florida. The packed courtroom fell silent as America's first high-profile female serial killer took the stand. Eileen Wornos, already dubbed the Damsel of Death by newspapers, was growing visibly agitated as prosecutors questioned her claim that she killed 7 men in self-defense.
Your wife and
I would ask that you would point to the public office.
What might have seemed like calculated courtroom theatrics quickly proved to be something way more disturbing. When a prosecutor challenged Wornos' self-defense claims by pointing out that several victims had been shot multiple times in the back, well, she got a little upset.
I know I was raped. You weren't nothing but a bunch of stuff. Putting somebody who was to death.
3 officers rush in to restrain her as she's yelling, accusing everyone of corruption and conspiracy. Now, this outburst wouldn't be an isolated incident. In later interviews, Wornos' rage only intensified, especially when discussing how others were profiting from her infamy. And when one interviewer brought up the movies and books being created about her case, she delivered this chilling response.
It's making me get bitter, evil, angry. I've never been before in my life. Worse than even out there with those men. This is evil, what those people have done to me.
What set Wornos apart from the other killers wouldn't be just her gender, but her absolute conviction that she was the victim. And when challenged about the severity of her crimes, she would oftentimes become defensive and dismissive in this attempt to minimize what she had done.
Those men were shot, just shot in self-defense, boom, boom, boom. You know, they weren't cut up, they weren't sliced up, no OJ jazz, you know. And he said, I did the most horrendous crime in the whole wide world.
But behind these angry outbursts, there was a lifetime filled with abuse and betrayal. Abandoned by her mother, raised by alcoholic grandparents, and pregnant by the age of 13. Her life was basically a catalog of trauma. But what pushed her over the edge during her trial was the ultimate betrayal. Her lover, Tyria Moore, cooperated with police to secure her conviction. When the interviewer brings up that betrayal, Eileen's face goes completely cold, and her voice drops to almost a whisper as she delivers one of her most chilling responses.
That's why I don't care if I'm executed and leave this planet.
As the trial progressed, Eileen's outbursts became more frequent and bizarre. She would fire her attorneys, demand her own execution, and would rant about several conspiracies. At her final court appearance, she thanks the judge who sentenced her to death, screaming,
"I'll be up in heaven while you're all rotting in hell."
October 9th, 2002, Florida State Prison. Eileen finally got her wish when she was executed by lethal injection. Turned out that Eileen's final outburst was directed at the entire legal system, but our next killer lost it when he was asked about his youngest victims. April 1990, Sullivan Correctional Facility, New York. Arthur Shawcross, aka the Genesee River Killer, sat down for this interview where he calmly discusses killing 12 women in Rochester. Now, for the first hour, Shawcross was surprisingly cooperative, casually talking about his crimes against women. When asked about his double life, doing things like trying to maintain a normal marriage while also hunting down victims, his response shocked everyone.
I guess I could say I was enjoying myself.
But then the interview takes an even darker turn when the topic shifted to his first and youngest victims, Jack Blake and Karen Hill. Shawcross's entire demeanor changes instantly. His face hardened, his breathing quickened, and his previously relaxed posture became tense. At one point, he even raised his hand to pause the interview.
Why you're prepared to talk about it and not Watertown?
I don't want to talk about it. You say one more question, I leave.
But the interviewer persisted, showing him pictures of the children and asking directly what he did to their bodies. Now this crossed an invisible line, and Shawcross, who had been so open about his adult victims, was now starting to shut down. Prison guards later reported that they'd never seen him like that. His usual calculated composure was completely gone. To deflect from the questions about Shawcross would go into these wild stories about the atrocities he claimed to have committed in Vietnam, tales that investigators later proved were complete fabrications.
So I reach over my shoulder like this, right behind my neck, and I pull out a brand new machete. When she backed out, I come up behind her and took her head right there. I took a couple of hits, but the head came off. She body dropped to the ground.
And when challenged about the honesty of these war stories, Shawcross's anger, although controlled, was obvious.
Anything I tell you is facts of life. If you don't believe it, that's your prerogative.
Despite hours of interviews over the years, Shawcross never fully discussed the details of his child victims. No matter how hard those interviewers pushed, he always clammed up about those kids. He'd talk all day about his adult victims, but the moment someone asked about Karen or Jack, he'd shut down or change the subject. It was a line that he wouldn't even cross, as if these particular crimes were too dark even for him to revisit. November 10th, 2008, Albany Medical Center, New York. Arthur Shawcross dies from a heart attack, taking many of his secrets to the grave. Shawcross's rage had manifested as threatening intimidation, but our next killer's explosive temper led to one of the most violent outbursts ever recorded in a prison interview. February 1992, Maynard Correctional Center, Illinois. 2 years before his execution, John Wayne Gacey sat across from reporter Walter Jacobson for what would become an infamous interview. Known as the Killer Clown, Gacey was convicted of murdering 33 men and boys, burying most of them in his crawlspace beneath the home. And despite overwhelming evidence, including his own confessions to police, Gacey maintained his innocence throughout the interview, growing increasingly agitated as Jacobson questioned him about specific victims. So what began as a subtle irritation would escalate dramatically when Jacobson talks about one victim's mother, who'd been pretty vocal about wanting Gacey executed.
That one mother that gets on television all the time who thinks I should be given 33 injections. I think she ought to take 33 Valiums and go lay down.
This outburst shocked Jacobson, who'd been warned about Gacey's manipulative charm but not his volatile temper. The interviewer then tries to redirect the conversation, but Gacey was now on a roll. And when asked about comparisons to other serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, Gacey's anger reached new heights.
I have no comment on Jeffrey Dahmer because I'm not Jeffrey Dahmer. God, I hate that when they put me in the same club with them. Because if I know that I didn't commit the crime, then I have been given the injustice, and so has the families. And nobody gives a damn about the families.
But the most disturbing moment came later in that interview when Gacey, who had seemingly calmed down by this point, decided to demonstrate his knowledge of tying a knot, the very method he would use to kill many of his victims.
Here, all you do is you wrap it around, you put one knot in it, and I said, then you put a second knot in it, okay? I said, then you take a stick and stick it in here, and you just turn this, and I said, it causes an tourniquet. I said, that's the only knot I ever learned.
That demonstration sent chills throughout the interview team, because it was literally the same knot he used to strangle his victims with. On May 10th, 1994, at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, Gacey's taken out by lethal injection, and with that, the families of his victims felt like they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But right up until his final day, he never admitted what he did nor show any sadness for the victims' families. The same angry and defensive Gacey we just saw in that interview stayed that way until the very end. But as disturbing as this killer clown was, our next killer's interview contains something even more chilling.
Milwaukee police found body parts in a North Side apartment, and now they wonder if they've uncovered some kind of death factory.
September 1993, Columbia Correctional Institution, Wisconsin. Reporter Nancy Glass sat across from one of America's most infamous killers, unsure of what to expect here. Jeffrey Dahmer, aka the Milwaukee Cannibal, confessed to killing 17 men and boys. and doing unspeakable things to their remains.
So we thought it was a Steve freezer, and now we found out he's got dead bodies in it.
It wouldn't be his calm demeanor that disturbed Glass, but how easily Dahmer transitioned between seemingly normal and absolute terror. When asked about what drove his crimes, Dahmer's response was matter of fact.
Had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to, I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
This wasn't defensiveness at all. It was something even more disturbing. Complete detachment from the suffering he'd inflicted on both his victims, as well as the families left behind to pick up the pieces. Throughout this interview, Dahmer described his crimes as if he were talking about ordering a pizza. And when asked about how he could do these things to another human being, well, he acted as if it wasn't him committing these acts.
It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to do things you shouldn't do.
Now, what really shocked everyone watching this wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Here we have a calm and well-spoken man who happened to be explaining why he drilled holes into people's heads and dissolved their bodies in acid. And when Glass finally decides to press him about whether he felt any disgust or even a shred of guilt after killing someone, Dahmer's response made everyone feel like they weren't talking to an actual human.
At the time, it was almost addictive. It was almost a surge of energy. I wouldn't have to worry about any of their needs or anything. I just had complete control of the situation.
But Dahmer's most disturbing response came when Glass asked him about the unthinkable. Why did he decide to consume parts of his victims?
It was a way of making me feel that they were a part of me. At first it was just curiosity, and then it became compulsive.
The whole interview crew later said that the most unnerving aspect was the complete absence of any normal human emotion, with one cameraman later saying that he started feeling physically ill as Dahmer calmly discussed running live experiments on his victims, and being disappointed that they often failed to produce the result he was looking for.
Then I tried to keep the person alive by inducing a zombie-like state. By injecting first dilute acid solution into their brain or hot water, and it never did completely work.
When asked if anything could have stopped his killing spree, Dahmer didn't hesitate.
Dead set on going with this compulsion. It was the only thing that gave me any satisfaction.
Jeffrey Dahmer never got the chance to flip out nor lose control in an interview. And in November 1994, at the Colombian Correctional Institution, he was brutally beaten to death by a fellow inmate who later said he was doing God's work by ridding the world of an evil man. Now, while Dahmer's disturbing calmness did set him apart from our other subjects, our next interview shows that sometimes the most terrifying reaction isn't an explosion of rage, but a killer's cold, calculated demonstration of pure evil. August 2009, Maricopa County Jail, Arizona. The woman sitting across from this interviewer didn't look particularly threatening. With her hair pulled back, wearing her standard prison attire, 33-year-old Angela Simpson appeared ordinary. But dear God, what she was about to say would leave everyone in shock.
I know the crimes of passion or something, and in the heat of the moment, but to spend 3 days driving nails into a guy's head and pulling his teeth out.
Right.
Why?
I found it necessary.
Simpson had just been arrested for one of the most brutal murders in Phoenix's history. She had lured 46-year-old Terry Neely, a disabled man, to an abandoned apartment where she then mercilessly tortured him for 3 days. Now, the details of what she did are almost too gruesome to comprehend. But unlike other killers who would try to minimize their actions or maybe claim innocence, Simpson almost seemed proud of what she'd done. So when asked if she did murder Neely, she couldn't be more direct.
You're very upfront.
Pretty much.
About talking about this killing.
Right.
You murdered this man.
Yes.
You tortured him.
Of course.
This interviewer, clearly unsettled by her casualness, then for some reason asked if she felt any remorse. And of course, Simpson's response was nothing short of indifferent.
Yeah, in court today you said you're not here to pretend to be remorseful.
Of course not. Why would I do that?
Are you remorseful?
Not at all.
Why?
Why would I be?
Now, what separates this person from our other killers on the list is that Simpson seemed irritated that anyone would question her actions or even expect her to feel bad about them. So when this interviewer wants some details about that 3-day torture session, her impatience was a little obvious.
What do you mean?
I
took him to my house, walked him down the street. I don't know why the media acts like he couldn't walk. He walked very well. Walked him upstairs, kicked him.
Now, the real flipping out moment would come when the interviewer tried to understand Simpson's motivations. Now, she claimed Neely was a snitch, but when pressed for proof, her annoyance escalated rapidly.
Well, he picked the wrong to say that to if he wanted to brag about putting so many people in prison. He picked the wrong person.
Yeah, that's what did it to him. That's why.
What, the bragging?
The bragging
Oh, yeah.
About putting people in prison.
Right.
Man, even the interview team said that the temperature in the room seemed to drop whenever she became irritated. Simpson was eventually handed life in prison plus 14 years for the torture and murder of Terry Neely. But what makes her case so disturbing would be the complete absence of any kind of humanity in her responses. No rage, no defensiveness, just cold ownership of one of the most horrific murders in the state's history. Now, Simpson might have been a little too proud of her violence, but our next killer really tried desperately to justify his horrific actions through some pretty bizarre religious claims. January 2017, San Diego County Jail, California. The interview room felt tense as 28-year-old Manuel Vela takes his seat. Just a month earlier, this disgusting person murdered his pregnant girlfriend, Katrina Rivera, and cut out their unborn child from her body. The interviewer asked Vela directly about what he had done, and his response was out there.
Did you cut the baby out of her?
Yes, I did.
Why?
Prove a point to religion.
Now, unlike our previous subjects, who seemed to be somewhat aware of the situation they were in, Vela got into these bizarre rambling explanations, suggesting a severe mental illness. And when asked if he knew the baby was his own child, his answer made that interviewer visibly uncomfortable.
First and foremost, to defy every religion-based political, to defy every law of any God creation of a book. You understand?
Throughout the entire interview, Vela would go from moments of clarity to complete delusion. And when asked if his girlfriend understood what was about to happen to her, Vela made this claim.
I understood, yes, that I was gonna kill her. She understood that she had to die.
And she was okay with that?
Well, that's it. She accepted it, yes.
Now, what makes this really hard to watch was that he was claiming he was following divine instructions.
Me?
Yeah.
I'm the Antichrist. I'm capable of taking severe business of any God that ever said the Creator was here to defy law.
As the interview progressed, Vela described receiving instructions starting when he was 7 years old, claiming that supernatural forces guided his actions. Well, they cut this interview short when it was clear Vela was unable to provide any coherent responses. And by February 28th, 2017, just a month after that disturbing interview, Manuel Vela was found dead in his cell. He was suffering from a complete break from reality that made his interviews one of the most unsettling ever recorded. But our next killer's interview shows something equally as chilling. A cold, calculated psychopath who viewed his heinous crimes as just another job well done. It's the early 70s, Santa Cruz, California. Edmund Keer murdered 6 female hitchhikers in California, dismembering their bodies and taking photographs as trophies. He then killed his mother and her friend. After his mother's murder, Keer called the police and confessed to all the killings while waiting in his car in Colorado. When cops hesitated to believe him, he would wait patiently for him to connect his confession to the ongoing murder investigations. November 1973. This guy was given 8 concurrent life sentences, and despite him being eligible for parole, Keer repeatedly stated he's happy in prison and waived his right to parole hearings. March 1984. California medical facility, Vacaville. Now in his mid-30s, Edmund Keer had plenty of time to reflect on his crimes, and the interviewers are eager to understand what goes through the mind of such a unique killer. And this time he would be asked specifically about what drove him to kill college students in the Santa Cruz area. His answer showed a disturbing connection to his mother.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her.
As his killing spree continued, he began taking more and more risks, kinda like daring the world to catch him.
I started flaunting that invisibility. Human head, 2 of them, at night in front of my mother's residence, with her at home, my neighbors at home upstairs.
But the scariest moment had to be when Keer described an encounter with a couple while he was carrying a bag with some horrific contents.
It had her head in it. Walking up to my apartment, past a happy couple coming down the stairs who nodded and smiled at me as they went by.
Keer's disturbing quality had to be his complete composure while describing all of these horrors. But nothing was more unsettling than his final decision to murder his mother. After picking up 2 young women in Berkeley, Keer tested his self-control, wondering if he could resist his violent urges. When they got into his car, wanting to head in a certain direction, he knew they were in for a terrible surprise.
And I'm saying to myself, oh my God, all I gotta do is relax and they'll take me to their death.
His internal struggle would happen 1 week before finally deciding to kill his mom. Keer then goes on to describe his mother's final moments.
And she went out to a party, she got soused, she came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that, came out, I walked up to her bed, she's laying there reading a paperback. As many thousands of nights before.
But then, Keer does something unexpected. He gets emotional.
And she said, oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now. And I looked at her, I said, no. I said, good night. And I knew I was going to kill her.
Was he sad about killing her? Was he still angry at her, even years later? Or was he just remembering all those nights she put him down? We'll probably never know what went through his mind, but the fact that the only time this cold-blooded killer showed real feelings was when recalling his mom's final words to him before he killed her, showing us that Keer might be more self-aware than people give him credit for. Now, after killing her, Keer does the unthinkable to his mother's remains. And his explanation for these acts reveal the raw hatred that had built up over decades.
She said, I haven't had sex with a man because of you, my murderous son. Is one of our arguments. I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse.
Edmund Keer remains in prison to this day, having been denied parole multiple times. And interestingly, unlike many of our subjects, he's never sought release, once stating that he was
not fit to walk among normal people.
Which is maybe the most self-aware statement ever made by a serial killer. Now, our next killer's interview reveals something even just as unsettling. We're going to talk about a man who got some special kind of sick pleasure from the pain and terror of children. August 1990, Florida State Prison, Stark. Gerald Schaefer figured out how to capitalize on his notoriety. This former cop-turned-killer sits across from true crime author Sandra London, who was once his high school girlfriend. Now, what made Schaefer different from other killers here was his desperate need for attention. Most killers would try to minimize their crimes or present themselves as misunderstood. But Schaefer wanted the world to know just how dangerous he really was. The interview starts normally enough, with Schaefer discussing the book of fiction he had written from prison, stories that investigators believed were thinly veiled confessions to actual murders. But when London asks him about the public reaction to his writing, Schaefer's response revealed his twisted motivation.
And I'd like to do something with my life, that exemplifies the good as opposed to the bad. And I had hoped that killer fiction would have would be something that would be good.
So what shocked the interviewer was how he seemed to revel in its impact. When asked if his stories were meant to horrify readers or glorify murder, his response wasn't what many would expect.
Does it make you want to hate murder? Or does it make you want to do murder? Because if it makes you want to hate murder, then it's working.
Now, the most disturbing moment had to be when Schaefer discussed his conversations with fellow serial killer Ted Bundy, who was on Florida's death row at the same time. Schaefer claimed that Bundy confessed to him about additional murders, and then proceeding to boast about his own crimes would impress Bundy.
Had followed my case in the detective magazines.
Bundy also apparently asked how many victims Schaefer really had, and that's when his competitive nature emerged in one of the most chilling exchanges ever recorded with a serial killer.
How many did you get really, Jerry? They said 34. I said, Dad, I'm the best.
Schaefer explains that his boasting was partly to torment Bundy, who was scheduled for execution while Schaefer had a life sentence.
And he was afraid that I had ones that he didn't know about. And he was always trying to get me to say, no, that's all I got, 34, But I never would say that.
And while investigators officially linked him to 2 murders, Schaefer himself claimed closer to 100, a number that can't be verified, but he desperately wanted people to believe. December 1995. Schaefer stabbed to death by another inmate at Florida State Prison, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. And now we segue to another shocking confession about a man who not only admitted to unspeakable acts against but seemed to take pride in describing them in excruciating detail. August 1994, Somers State Prison, Connecticut. The slight unassuming person sitting across from this interviewer doesn't really match the typical image of a serial killer. But Michael Bruce Ross, known as the Roadside Strangler, confessed to murdering 8 women across Connecticut and New York in the early 80s. And unlike other killers who deny their crimes or maybe blame outside factors, Ross was strangely open about his murders. That calm, measured response was somehow more disturbing than any angry outburst. Now, from the beginning of the interview, Ross set himself apart by downplaying his crimes in a way that seemed designed to minimize his place in criminal history.
Well, I'm a serial killer. I've killed 8 women, 6 in this state and 2 in New York. I'm not a big serial killer, by the way. 8 people, that's nothing. I mean, there's a lot of other guys you can go see.
The interviewer, visibly uncomfortable with Ross's casual tone, pressed him for details about one of his attacks. And what followed would be a very detailed account delivered as if Ross was describing anything outside of a horrific crime.
I saw this woman walking along the road with a stroller. I pulled off the side of the road. She came into the driveway, walked up the driveway. I was behind the house. She saw me and I grabbed her. I told her that if she didn't do what I wanted, that I would smash his head against the wall of the house.
And when they asked him if he felt in control during his attacks, he provided yet another unsettling glimpse into his psychological state.
When I attacked her, I don't believe I was in control. I don't think I could have stopped. Reason I say that is because there's a very clear point to me after she was dead when I was feeling, well, I didn't really feel anything.
And here's where it gets interesting. Ross goes on to talk about his crimes almost as if he were watching them happen to someone else.
I mean, I knew what was going on, and I saw what was going on, but it was more like watching an old film that we used to see as kids in the high school, you know, I mean, in elementary school. And they've been played so many times, they're all spliced, and it'd be going along and then jump.
Unlike many serial killers who have vivid memories of their victims' faces, Ross claims to have a strange disconnect from the actual moments of murder. The interviewer had a tough time buying that, but Ross's response was disturbingly matter-of-fact.
You would think that if you killed somebody, that you would have that face imprinted in your mind, and that you wouldn't be able to get it out of your mind. I don't have that. I never had that. The only face that I can see is what was in the newspapers a few days later.
Now, what's going to set Ross apart from our other killers is that one victim here seemed to hit him a little differently than the others. When he was talking about Leslie Shelley, who he killed alongside her friend April Brunez, Ross showed what appeared to be genuine remorse.
Well, the smallest one, Leslie Shelley, has always bothered me more than the others. I think it was because she was so small. I think it was because she was so cooperative. And I think it was because the way she was killed was so close to the fantasies.
Ross's interview never featured explosive rage or calculated intimidation. Instead, his calm, analytical approach would be more disturbing somehow, and he would present himself almost as a collaborator with the interviewer, trying to understand his own actions rather than defend them. Michael Ross eventually became the last person to be executed in Connecticut, voluntarily ending his appeals and requesting that his death sentence be carried out. On May 13, 2005, Ross was executed by lethal injection, having spent his final years giving out interviews and writing about the compulsions he claimed drove him to kill. Now, while Ross disturbed us with his clinical analysis, our final chapter explores a killer who competed for the title of the best in one of the most bizarre interviews ever recorded. March 2009, Mule Creek State Prison, California. This gray-haired man sitting across investigators right here, who looks like anybody's grandfather, is actually one of California's most notorious serial killers. You see, Roger Kibby, the I-5 killer, terrorized Northern California for over a decade, murdering at least 7 young women between 1977 and 87. Now, what makes this interview particularly significant was its timing. After decades of silence, DNA evidence finally linked Kibby to additional victims beyond the single murder he'd been convicted of in 1991. So investigators now had the opportunity to confront them with this new evidence. But Kibby had a different approach than his peers when he got cornered. For years, he would maintain his innocence in all but one murder. But as investigators laid out DNA evidence connecting him to multiple victims, that carefully constructed facade began to crack. The most telling moment would come when detectives asked about Lou Ellen Burley, a 21-year-old woman who disappeared in 1977 after going to meet Kibby for a job interview. For years, he denied any involvement, but now Kibby's faced with irrefutable scientific evidence. The realization that science finally caught up with him was visible. When asked why he killed his victims, his answer was simple.
I don't know why I did what I did, to see if it could be done. I've said that before.
The interviewer was visibly shook by how detached Kibby seemed, and so he called him out on his bizarre explanation. But Kibby was still unable to see his mistakes.
So you're given the answer, like, why do you climb Mount Everest?
Because it's there.
And here's where things get scary. Later on in this interview, Kibby gets into the topic of his mental state during the actual moments of the killing. And unlike other killers who claim to feel powerful or even excited during murder, Kibby describes it as something taking over.
No. I felt bad later. I did it, thinking about it. But while it was happening, blank mind. Don't think of anything. It's like a fog.
Even more chilling would be how Kibby describes making any sort of eye contact while he's in the middle of killing his victims.
Look up at the stars if they're ready. that one in Berryessa up on the hill. When I was doing her, I looked up and saw the Big Dipper. I just stared at the Big Dipper while I had my hands around her throat.
This complete emotional disconnect is exactly what allowed Kibby to continue killing for over a decade. But when asked directly if there was any pleasure in the killings themselves, his answer was surprising, to say the least.
No, none whatsoever.
Curiosity?
Maybe. It was an act that should never have happened. But I was too far into it.
Now, what made Kibby a unique serial killer would be his methodical, almost ritualistic approach to murder. He would carefully select and stalk his victims. Investigators believe that he kept a so-called murder kit in his car, which included handcuffs and pre-cut lengths of cord, a detail contributing to his nickname, as he used a cord to his victims. When investigators pressed for details about his other victims, Kibby was initially resistant. This guy was more focused on what he could gain from any cooperation than to boast about crime. The detective who interviewed him took note of his calculating nature, always weighing what information might lead to avoiding the death penalty. When asked about how he selected his victims from all the women he encountered, Kibby admitted he didn't even understand his own process.
I don't know why I picked these 7 out of all that I picked up and let loose.
Even more disturbing would be his answer when they asked him at what point he decided a victim would die.
I haven't figured that one out yet. I don't know if it's halfway down the road or while I'm doing it.
Eventually, Kibby agreed to a plea deal. He would confess to additional murders in exchange for life without parole instead of the death penalty. That approach to his own fate showed a man who, even when caught, was still trying to keep control of the situation. Now, in exchange for being spared the death penalty, Kibby agreed to help investigators locate the remains of Lou Ellen Burley. And that cold, almost business-like way he handled the negotiation showed a man that was devoid of remorse or human emotion. Just a calculating mind, looking for the best possible deal. By the end of this lengthy interview process, Kibby confessed to 7 murders, though investigators suspected there could be more. He was given multiple life terms without the possibility of parole and returned to Mule Creek State Prison to serve out his days. But in a twist of fate that many may call poetic justice, Kibby's story would end in a manner strikingly similar to how his victims' lives had ended. February 28, 2021, Mule Creek State Prison, California. 81-year-old Kibby was found to death by his cellmate.